This is the Fifth Estate winning headlines, your media police post. In this segment, we summarize some of the headlines that you may have missed this morning, but we also take a look at the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. Today is the 4th of March 2021, and I am 2J.
I am CS.
And I am Miss K. Again, in case you missed today's headlines, here they are. Daily Nation, a dose of hope. The Standard, House search for KPA boss hit brick wall. And The Star, iebc fresh crisis may delay June referendum.
Yes.
Daily Nation.
Start with that.
Nation is highlighting the milestone in the fight against COVID due to the arrival of the COVID-19 vaccines, much awaited.
Yes.
The 1.02 million doses that just came in are enough for slightly over 500,000 people. This is because every person is given 2 doses of the vaccine over a period of 8 to 12 weeks. So what firstly needs to be understood is that this is just phase 1 and that more doses of the vaccines will be flown in over the next several months.
Yeah.
This first consignment is meant for frontline workers, that's doctors and nurses, teachers and the police, because they're most exposed, and they'll start receiving these jabs from tomorrow. Now the aim here is to curtail the spread of the viruses in schools, hospitals and correctional facilities, prisons and the like. Phase 2, which is meant to run from July this year, will target an additional 9.76 million people. The focus in this phase will be the most vulnerable, such as the elderly and those above 18 years with underlying conditions. Phase 3 will then cover an additional 4.9 million people. And after this coverage will be increased depending on the availability of vaccines. Ultimately, President Uhuru's regime has put in place a plan to vaccinate almost half the country in just over 3 years, which is quite impressive. And then some very sly fellows will want to mislead the country into thinking that the president does not have a plan to fight COVID, when in fact his onslaught against the virus and the pandemic has demonstrated incredible leadership in a time of crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, the contrast is clear. Compare what President Uhuru has done with leaders who want you to focus on the past, talking about political debts and what they are owed and what they deserve. And they want the whole country to stop so that we can focus on their messy campaigns and their insults. Compare number 1, we have seen the vaccine has arrived and there's a clear rollout plan to vaccinate almost half the country, while some people want you to focus on wheelbarrows, insults, and misinformation. Number 2, let us look at the rapid expansion of our healthcare facilities. For example, from the time the virus hit our shores in around March of last year, the number of infectious disease ICU beds were increased from 8 to 827.
Wow.
Furthermore, the number of isolation beds were increased to about 7,400 beds by September, and then by December, this number had again tripled to almost 21,000 isolation beds. What do other people want you to focus on? Wheelbarrows, insults, and misinformation. Number 3, while some people want to lie that Uhuru hasn't fought COVID and its effects, let us remind you, the president unveiled a national response for the economy, which was an 8-point economic stimulus program of Kenya shillings 56.6 billion. This was in addition to lowering what banks are required to hold in cash reserves so as to provide extra liquidity to the banking sector. This had the effect of injecting 35 billion shillings into the economy, in addition to the 56.6 billion from the stimulus program. What do other people want you to focus on?
Wheelbarrows, insults, and misinformation.
The same campaign that wants you to think that the president has not been fighting COVID is the same campaign that wants to mislead you into thinking the president has not been working for you. They want you to focus on wheelbarrows, lies, and misinformation.
Fantastic. I think, Chaka, what you're hitting at is the fact that our president is forward-looking.
Exactly.
You know, why are we focusing on what happened in the past when we have a leader who's telling us where we're going to be tomorrow, in 2 years, in 3 years? And I think that's what we need to focus on. Our media want us to be upset. They want us to be misled. They want us to be depressed, and I think that's terrible.
And I think I'll address that media just right now. And I'll begin by attacking the Star. We have a headline today, and the Star decided to engage in a speculation exercise. It decided to tell us that the IEBC is dead. And because it is dead, there will be no referendum, there will be no boundary delimitation, and no general election come 2022. Okay, maybe that's a stretch. But before I address the speculation, let us address the facts. To be properly constituted, IEBC is required to have at least 3 commissioners. This is a constitutional requirement. And according to the IEBC website, it has 3 commissioners: Wafula Chebukati, the chairperson, Professor Guliye, and Mr. Bolu. According to the Star, there has been a fallout between Commissioner Molu and the acting CEO, Marjan Hussein Marjan. So Commissioner Molu has reportedly declined to attend commission meetings, thereby consistently denying a legal quorum to the commission. The implication here is that the commissioner will resign, thereby paralyzing IEBC and stopping the referendum. Now, I don't know about you, but it sounds to me like this is a sponsored story, a political dog whistle. For those who don't know, a dog whistle is a whistle whose pitch is so high that only dogs can hear it and obey it. In politics, a political dog whistle is a message whose consumption is not for the general public, but a selected few who will understand the message and perform the required task. So allow me to engage also in a little bit of speculation. Does the IEBC really have 3 commissioners, or will the other commissioners come back for such a time as this? Why do I ask this? The IEBC Act gives a timeline of about 3 months for the replacement of a commissioner if there is a vacancy in the commission. This timeline begins exactly 21 days after the position is declared vacant. And Akombe ran away almost 2 years ago, and the rest went into hiding shortly thereafter. But did they receive stamped letters from the government of Kenya accepting their resignation? Was their position really declared vacant? I don't know. I've not seen any person trying to have them. We've said in the past that politics is war, and the first casualty in war is truth. Every war is fought in at least 2 fields. The first field is the battlefield. The second field is the minds of the people. And in the time of war, what is said on the enemy side is always propaganda, and what is said on your side is truth and righteousness. So somebody is executing a scheme using the media. But the question is who and why, and who benefits if the referendum is stalled?
Ooh,
Maswala nyeti.
wow, you've taken us back into history.
I have, I've tried.
Okay, interesting. I think on that note, could we park the Star
I agree.
and the Daily Nation?
I agree.
And before I get into my commentary, I want to instantly toss the Standard,
Oh, definitely.
which talks about KPA, if I'm not wrong.
God.
And this week I want to address some of the bashing that we've been doing towards the Deputy President, which admittedly was quite harsh.
Not enough.
But to say that RUTO suffers from a poverty of imagination is to actually undermine him. After all, he managed to steal the Rift Valley from Gideon Moi and hypnotize the minds of central Kenya. But while Gideon lost his inheritance to a chicken seller and has apparently given up, the story of central Kenya is a story of an abandoned coup d'etat. And I will explain this using a Fifth Estate classic, The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. In our opinion, RUTO is a bad student. And just like Arp Moi, who received an abridged version of The Prince from Wanguhu Nganga, it has become clear to us that RUTO is reading the same summarized version. Because of this, RUTO read the parts that suited him and failed to learn the whole lesson. So today we will do it for him. Machiavelli gave 2 rules on acquiring principalities through moral crimes. The first came from Agathocles, who after becoming ruler of Syracuse held a banquet in the city for the elite. And this is when he decided to consolidate his power. At his command, his soldiers killed all of the city's leaders and the most wealthy. He then declared himself leader with no opposition. Machiavelli gives us this story of a leader who acts quickly and decisively. Do all the bad things at once and the people will forget. This is how you acquire power. But there is another rule in this chapter, and this is what William RUTO failed to read. It is of Oliverto Uffredecci of Italy, and like Agathocles, Uffreducci hosted a banquet and consolidated power by killing all of his enemies. But in an ironic twist of fate, he was later murdered in the same way by his opponents during a similar banquet. He begged and he pleaded and he even blamed his second in command for what he did. But just like how he gained his power, Uffreducci lost it in the same way. So what is my point? We know that Uhuru Kenyatta is a student of Machiavelli. We know that he is watching keenly. Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. Uhuru Kenyatta is watching him, and be sure, he will finish William RUTO politically by using his own devices against him. Just like how he's gained his power, RUTO will lose it in the same way.
The church said amen.
We have a 3-part criteria that we use to judge the headlines for you. I really had nothing to say there. Perfect point. We ask ourselves, is the headline topical or speculative, repetitive or groundbreaking, thoughtful or just plain lazy? Daily Nation, a dose of hope versus the Star, iebc crisis. I'd say we toss the Star.
Yeah, exactly. Based on speculation, right?
Very speculative.
Yeah.
And I'd say that the Daily Nation gives us our winning headline.
Agreed.
Onto the political pieces that we call cartoons, but they were all uninspiring and therefore we tossed them all. We have no winning cartoon. And now our final thought, but before we get there, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the like button.
And switch on notifications.
Oh, definitely.
And now our final thought. Today is inspired by a book entitled The Folly of Fools: The Logic of Deceit and Self-Deception in Human Life, written by Robert Trivers. So Trivers is actually an evolutionary biologist. And in this book, he investigates why lying and self-deception play such a prominent role in our lives. That's not something I ever thought I would say. So he studied self-deception in humans, and he asked how it evolved to be so pervasive. Humans are masters at self-deception, he tells us, and we regularly deceive ourselves in a variety of different circumstances. But what does self-deception, and he calls it perceiving reality to be different than it actually is? What does this self-deception have to do with survival? And he says, why is it that genetic tendencies for self-deception are more likely to be shared with the next generation? Why are these things that we share in our genetic code? And so he talks about deception and detection. So on one hand, he says deception is everywhere, and it's expected in many relationships, whether human, animal, nature. But detection, he says, is always catching up with that deception. So he says, like a rumor, a lie is halfway around the world before the truth has had time to put its shoes on. I think everybody's heard that saying, right? So he says when a new deception shows up in nature, it's very rare that a defense system even exists to detect it. And he calls this deceit a deep feature of life, and even a necessity, given that our genes are always struggling. They have this struggle to survive. And so he gives examples of the anglerfish, which lure their prey in by dangling a part of itself that looks like a worm to attract other fish, and then it eats them. And then he gives the example of butterflies that deter predators by camouflaging or adopting the colors of poisonous species. He says viruses and bacteria use deception to sneak past a host's immunity system, coronavirus, right? And even before we can speak, he tells us, babies learn to cry insincerely to manipulate our caregivers. You know that fake cry babies do because they want to be held and loved.
Believe you me, I know.
So he says we fool others because deception can have these enormous evolutionary benefits. And in many circumstances, especially social ones, individuals who are good at deception are better able to survive and reproduce. Very strange. So if fooling others has obvious benefits, why do we then go and fool ourselves? That comes from the title of self-deception. And he gives a few answers. He says that if we believe that we are smarter better looking, more righteous than we really are, it can help us to seduce and persuade others. I don't know if that's a dating tip. And he says the more that we believe our own lies, the more sincerely and effectively we can then go and lie and deceive others. He says, we hide reality from our conscious minds, the better to hide it from other onlookers. So I guess the book told me in the end that there has to be some benefit from lying. Not that I'll take it up. But
well, I think what he's telling you is to fake it till you make it. That's
Right?
self-deception. And then it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So because I believe it so hard, then it'll happen. I'll manifest it.
Yeah.
That's the positive way to look at what you just said. Anyway, today I'd like to speak about biased memory. And let me begin with a story. This story is told in a Netflix series, not the book, but the series is on the mind. And it's about a woman named Melanie. And she tells us her memory of 9/11. She described her panicked her voice as she had a phone call with her mother who worked in New York City at the time. Melanie recalled how the smoke from the towers circled outside her classroom window, and she went to school in New Jersey. That's not too far away. Anyway, she also remembered how she watched the smoke come down the river and the fear that she felt. I hope I'm painting this picture correctly and that you're feeling it. However, her memory of this day never happened. How crazy is that? Why? Because her mother didn't work in New York. She worked many, many miles away in Connecticut. Her class was nowhere near New York, and there was no river. And her classroom, guess what? That window that she so vividly remembered, it faced a wall. It turns out that memories aren't necessarily reliable as the way most of us think they are. In fact, if you ask someone to pull out a memory, they feel like it's this picture-perfect image they have stored of a moment in time. According to the author, we more easily remember positive information about ourselves and either forget the negative or with time transmute it to be neutral or even positive. Memories are continually distorted in self-serving ways. He says that people remember voting in elections that they did not and giving to charities that they did not. And if they did vote, they remember supporting the winning candidate rather than the one they actually voted for. People continually recreate their own memories, or we can invent completely fictitious memories. As has been said, my memory is so good I can remember things that never happened. My takeaway from this: trust no one, even myself and my memories. But I will say this book had so many chapters that called to me. I think that everyone should pick it up and read it.
But on that memory bias, I'm so guilty. I have some memories that I know did not happen, but the way I have this vivid picture painted in my mind, it's quite bizarre how, that came to be.
And it's not truthful.
And it's
Do
not
not trust it.
I think there's a writer who once said that the faintest ink is more powerful than the strongest memory.
I agree with that.
Okay.
I focused on chapter 11, War and Deception, and I felt it would be quite apt in helping shine some light on recent political events. Author Robert Travis highlights how the folly of fools can sometimes manifest through fatal overconfidence. He takes the example of how the US was fatally overconfident going into the Vietnam War in the 1960s. The United States underestimated the discipline of the Viet Cong and their willingness to absorb punishment. In fact, Tujay here was telling me how the US suffered from what Professor Mutahi calls cognitive tunneling. When the US was presented with facts and the data pointing to how they may potentially lose, they ignored that initial analysis and fired those experts and hired others who would tell them what they wanted to hear. Which is why I think also Prof tells us that William RUTO only advises himself. Anyway, cognitive tunneling happens when people make up their minds and don't want to be confused with the facts. This is a prime example of self-deception. In the case of the US, what was striking about their mistake is that they completely underestimated how determined the Viet Cong were to protect home ground. Their guerrilla warfare tactics of the Viet Cong effectively discombobulated US military technology. But more than the guerrilla warfare tactics, the advantage the Viet Cong had was home ground advantage. The lizard will win in his or her own territory against an opponent.
Yes.
This is why William Ruto had and continues to have fatal overconfidence with his forays into the Gema nation. Ruto ventured into the Gema nation over 100 times, whereas the Mudamaki only needed 1 weekend in Sagana. One visit was enough to expose Ruto's folly of fools. And the author, Robert Travers, poses a very poignant question. Why would one ever assume that the locals cared less about your invasion of their land than you do? Put in another way, is it not the folly of fools to assume that Ruto cares more about Gema than the president?
Oh, that's such a good point.
As you ponder that, let us also send a very clear message to Gema. Just like the Viet Cong, your motivation should be stronger to protect what you have than to seize what you do not.
Amen.
Through BBI, what you have is an increase in over 50 billion annually. In total, that's almost 115 billion.
Yeah.
And that is what you stand to lose if you believe Ruto can give you something better without even explaining what that something is.
Wow.
Ooh,
That's so
tough
strong.
words.
Very powerful.
But I do think it's very true, and you are very right, Tuje. That is a strong point and needs to be repeated. How can you think that somebody else knows more about you than those
Than you
with
do.
home ground advantage?
Right?
Today we had a winning headline from the Daily Nation and no winning cartoon. I'll leave you with a quote. I was going to leave you with one, but I think I'll leave you with something else. Leo Tolstoy, author, said that the only thing we know is that we know nothing. Enjoy that. Have a great day.